Side 3, Objective Bajor, by John Peel. Continuing on page 82. Get me Morel, Sisko snapped at Kira. Then to Dax he added, move us closer to the Morven Falls. We have to stop them. Finally, he whirled around to O'Brien. Chief, get to the transporter room. Lock onto any life forms aboard that ship and beam them over as fast as possible. O'Brien acknowledged and ran for the turbolift. This was all he needed right now. Sisko was finding it more and more difficult to keep his temper under control. The universe seemed to be filled with nothing but lunatics at the moment. On screen, Kira called. Sisko glared up as Morel's image faded in. The warrior looked aged and tired, which wasn't surprising. Morel, he snapped, break off this suicide run. I'm having your crew beamed off now. No, Captain, Morel answered with some hint of steel still in his voice. This is my last chance to pay those murderers back for what they've done. Don't try and stop me. I have no option, Sisko thundered. If you attack the intruder, they'll annihilate whatever survivors there are from this massacre. Stand down now. No, Captain, Morel repeated. I'm sure that the survivors would agree with me. We have to strike back. Don't be a fool, Sisko exclaimed. There's nothing to be gained by this attack. Right now, the important thing is to look after the living, not avenge the dead. That can come later. Morel shook his head. There is no later, he said simply. There is only now. Goodbye. He cut the transmission, and the screen returned to stars. Damn that man, Sisko muttered. Major, what's he doing? Still on a collision course with the intruder, she reported. There was both pain and pride in her voice. He's not going out without a fight. That's what he thinks, Sisko said. Tapping his communicator, he called, Chief, how's it going? I'm trying to lock on, Captain, O'Brien's voice said from the air. With that power overload, it's going to be difficult. I can only chance taking out half a dozen or so at a time. Then do it as soon as you can, Sisko ordered. He turned to Odo. Any idea how long we have? The security officer scowled. About 4 minutes, I'd say. His face twitched. Those engines are really straining now. Sisko nodded. To Dax, he called, How close are we? 3,000 kilometers. Her hands were steady on the helm. Closing slowly. They've built up their own velocity quite well. Kira spoke up. When the ship explodes, will our shields be able to take it at this range? We'll have to find out, Sisko replied. Dax, use the tractor beam on maximum. Slow down the Morven Falls. Acknowledged. The Trill's fingers flew across her board even faster. Sisko leaned over her shoulder and adjusted the main viewer. The intruder vessel filled the whole screen. They were approaching it in pursuit of the Morven Falls. It had seemed impressive at a distance, but as they drew closer, it was breathtaking. The entire outer shell seemed to be smooth and polished. The lights of the stars reflected from the burnished metal, if it was exactly metal, creating a tinged reflection with the light spinning off in rainbow hues. As O'Brien had commented, these aliens had an incredible technology. It was appalling that they couldn't apply it constructively. Got her, Dax announced. But it may not hold. Tractor strength is only 87%. Sisko could see the tiny form of the Morven Falls on the screen now. The vague glow of the tractor field that had enfolded it showed up, thanks to the computer enhancement. The tractor lock had to hold. Transport commencing, Odo announced from his station. Then he shook his head. Chief doesn't have much time. Tractor lock is weakening, Dax announced, striving furiously to establish a stronger link. Those circuits still aren't back to normal, and they're starting to break down. Hold on, Sisko encouraged her, and the Defiant. Hold on, just another minute. The picture on the screen abruptly reverted to that of Morel, who was desperate and furious. Sisko, Let us go! I'm sorry, I can't do that, Sisko replied. Prepare to be beamed over. He cut the transmission by hand. They're overrunning their engines harder, Odo announced. It can't... His words were cut off as the screen exploded to white light, and then the dampening field closed down the incoming view. Dax slapped her hand down on her controls, cutting off the tractor beam. The shock wave of the explosion, transmitted down the tractor carrier way, slammed into the Defiant. Buffeted like an ancient sailing ship in a storm, the ship whirled, the inertial dampers striving to absorb and redirect the load. Sisko was sent stumbling against his own command chair, and he grabbed hold of it. The other bridge crew had all been seated and managed to stay that way by grabbing any available handholds. Then the blow faded, and the ship reverted to normal. Report, Sisko barked. Shields are holding, Odo announced, though we've lost several minor systems. The chief isn't going to be happy. Helm is responding to power again, Dax added. O'Brien, demanded Sisko, slapping his communicator. How many did you get off? 18, Captain, came the chief's voice. It was all I had time for. Well done, Sisko told him. That meant another 40 must have died in that futile gesture. War is hell indeed. Prepare to continue searching for survivors, he ordered. As the crew moved to obey, Dax glanced up. There's an incoming message from Hive Master Dran, she said, surprised. On screen, Sisko ordered. He straightened in his seat. What is it now? Dran's face looked slightly puzzled, if Sisko was reading him correctly. Captain Sisko, I owe you our thanks. We saw what you just did. You probably saved the lives of thousands of my people. I didn't do it for you, Sisko replied. I did it to prevent you from taking revenge on the survivors from your massacre. Why ever you did it, Dran answered, unperturbed, you have our thanks. I am quite surprised by your actions. His nose twitched. You do not live on a planet, do you? No, Sisko answered. We are from Deep Space Nine. It's a station in orbit about Bajor. He wondered if it was wise to give that information, but could see nothing to be gained by keeping the truth secret. Ah, Dran seemed happy with the news. I had suspected that you were an intelligent person. Sisko wondered what that was supposed to mean. I'm also a very angry one, he replied as calmly as he could. Right now, my priority is to help the survivors back to Bajor. Once that is done, he leaned forward in his seat. I promise you, I'll be back. The Hive Master nodded slightly. Yes, we may have a great deal to discuss. I look forward to seeing you again, Captain. The picture broke up. I look forward to feeling my hands around his scrawny neck, Kira muttered. Can you believe the nerve of him, making it sound like a social call? Sisko spun to face her. Well, he'll be disabused of that notion very quickly, he promised. Whatever Dran thinks, I aim to see that he pays very dearly for what he and his people have done to Durain. Chapter 11. Gul Dukat turned away from his screens, thinking furiously. The science team on the Keratan had decided that these unknown aliens were using some kind of monofilament weapon, which had interested him greatly. The level of the invaders' technology was quite formidable. There had to be some way to obtain it for Cardassia. Dukat had been completely unprepared to witness the destruction of Durain, however. Seeing the alien ship enclose and then demolish the world had been quite unsettling. Nothing was now left of the planet but a smoking, blackened core. That was a weapon the Cardassians needed to obtain. However, there was more than the seed of uncertainty in Dukat's mind. Could even they defeat a foe as powerful as this? He was certain that the aliens would never give over their technology willingly. It was bound to come down to a match of force. but Dukat could not be certain that the Cardassians would prevail in such a match. And, if attempted and lost, such a war would presumably end with Cardassia itself in the place of Durain 4. The stakes were very high indeed, but the prize might be worth taking that risk.
Sensors are functioning normally.
The Karatan had intercepted the conversation between Sisko and the Hive Master. Dukat had not been too surprised by Sisko's actions. He tended to be quite predictable, for the most part. And when he wasn't predictable, he was quite a formidable ally, or foe. Sisko had bought time to evacuate the refugees, and then aimed to return. Was he, too, after the alien technology? The Federation preferred to barter for such things, so perhaps Sisko was returning to contact his superiors and arrange for negotiations.
That information is not on.
It would be completely unacceptable for the Federation to possess this alien technology, and for the Cardassians to be denied it, of course. That would affect the balance of power here far too much. Dukat rose to his feet and glanced around the monitoring room. No one was paying any attention to him, which was as it should be. "Raul," he barked, "take over monitor control. If any further communications from the Karatan come through, acknowledge only, and then contact me immediately. I shall be in conference with the other Gulls. For the Karatan, and that alone, you are authorized to disturb me." "Understood," Raul replied, saluting. He marched across and took over Dukat's station. Dukat nodded curtly and then walked thoughtfully from the room. The next decision could not be his alone, but it would have to be made swiftly. The Federation could not be allowed to be the sole recipient of this alien technology. Better yet, the Federation should not possess it at all. It belonged in Cardassian hands. Deep Space Nine was a shambles. The Defiant had escorted most of the refugee ships that had fled the destruction of Durain back to the station. Many of them barely made the journey, and Sisko had been forced to evacuate 18 of the smaller, older vessels during the flight. The Defiant had been crowded when it had docked. Now, the several hundred smaller refugee vessels swarmed about the station, awaiting their turn at the docking ports. Sisko had contacted Lieutenant Soika on his way back, and he had managed to organize dozens of spare rooms. Others that had been unoccupied since the Cardassian departure 3 years before were being opened and prepped for temporary use. Everywhere one looked on the station, there was feverish activity. Many of the refugees had nothing but the clothes they wore. Even so, they were the lucky ones. Hundreds were in need of medical help, and Bashir had fled to the infirmary as soon as he could. He and his teams were working like dervishes, trying to get at least the most serious cases stabilized. Even so, there were hundreds waiting, with temporary bandages covering scar tissue, gashes, and sometimes even the stumps of lost limbs. Those survivors who were at least mobile tried to find rooms and stay out of the way, but it wasn't easy. They were tired, scared, sick, and angry. There was no way that they could forget what had happened to them, even for a moment. Shuttles were also arriving from Bajor with whatever medical staff and supplies Shakar had managed to obtain. It wasn't much, but it was a help, and it added to the congestion. As Sisko made his way to Ops, the cries, the despair, and the tears of the refugees gathered around him like a cloud. He couldn't afford to let his anger and sympathy affect his judgment, and he tried his hardest to steel his heart against reacting. It wasn't easy. Reaching Ops at least gave Sisko a little quiet. Only the essential staff were here, and the noise seemed muted compared with the rest of the station. Kira and Dax were already at their posts. O'Brien, of course, was nowhere to be seen. He was either helping to prep more rooms for the refugees, or else already back at work on the Defiant. Lieutenant Soika nodded to Sisko, and then took a science station out of the way. "Contact Starfleet," Sisko ordered him. "I want to speak with Admiral Noguchi immediately." He turned to Kira. "I think you'd better speak to Minister Shakar," he said gently. "Tell him everything that's happened." "And then what?" Kira asked pointedly. "He's bound to want to know what we're going to do." She didn't have to add what Sisko could read in her eyes. "And so do I. Tell him that we're going back as soon as the refugees are unloaded from the Defiant. We're going to talk with Hive Master Dron." "Just talk?" demanded Kira. "What would you have me do?" Sisko asked mildly. The tone should have warned her off, but it didn't. She glared at him. "Wipe them out," she said bluntly. "With what?" Sisko asked. "Even if the Chief gets the Defiant's weapons systems back online, I very much doubt we could take out that starship of theirs. And I'm not at all sure that we should, even if we could." Kira gave him a filthy look. "They massacred Durain." "I don't need to be reminded of that," Sisko answered. "But who is they? Is it every inhabitant of the Hive? That ship is enormous. It must contain a population of millions, if not billions. Are they all guilty? Or was the attack planned and executed only by the elite? Until I know for a fact which it was, I am not going to sanction genocide." Conflicting emotions warred across Kira's face. Finally, though, she managed to neutralize her expression and give a very tight nod. "I'm sorry, Captain," she said through gritted teeth. "You're right, of course. Genocide is not the answer." "Thank you." Sisko managed a weak smile. "But I'm sure you expressed an opinion a lot of people must hold by now. Probably one that Shakar will have. Do your best to see that he understands mine. Please." "Of course." Kira turned, and Sisko could see the tension in every muscle of her lithe body. It wasn't easy for her to control the urge to strike back. It wasn't a lot easier for him to restrain the same urge. "I have Admiral Noguchi for you, sir," Soika called out. "I'll take it in my office," Sisko replied. He felt almost as though he were fleeing ops and accusing eyes as he headed for his room. As the doors hissed shut, he hurried to his desk and tapped in the accept call code. The ancient, wrinkled face stared back at him. "Admiral." "Captain," Noguchi replied, inclining his head slightly. "You have something to report?" "Yes." Sisko sighed. "I have to report the destruction of Durain 4 and the deaths of a great number of its inhabitants. I'll be transmitting complete recordings, Admiral, but thought you should hear this immediately." He gave a brief report of all that had happened. "I'm getting ready to return to the Hive," he finished. "Hive Master Dron has agreed to a meeting." Noguchi's face seemed to have grown even more lines while Sisko had been talking. "And what do you aim to do, Captain?" he inquired. "Discover who is responsible for this massacre," he answered. "How long will it be before I can expect backup?" Scowling slightly, the Admiral answered, 7 days. "A week?" Sisko tried not to make it sound like a reprimand. "Isn't that a long time?" Noguchi nodded. "As you know, we don't like to keep too many large vessels in your sector, Captain. It makes the Cardassians rather nervous. Normally, the Enterprise would have been much closer, but..." He spread his hands. Sisko knew all about the recent destruction of the Enterprise D, of course. "The next closest vessels are the Farragut and the Pike. I've had both rerouted to you. The Farragut will arrive in 7 days, and the Pike in 9. That's the best I can do, Benjamin." That wasn't what Sisko had been hoping to hear. Knowledge that there was a starship close behind the Defiant would have boosted morale, especially his. "And how about our allies, sir?" he asked carefully. "Any chance of help there?" "The Klingons are being rather difficult at the moment," Noguchi answered politely. "They will not be able to spare aid. The Cardassians, of course, have 3 fleets in your vicinity, but they also claim they can spare no ships. Marvelous, muttered Sisko. So it's entirely up to me, then. I have tremendous faith in you, Benjamin, Noguchi answered. How are repairs to the Defiant progressing? At last word, we had no weapons up and running, Sisko informed him. I imagine that will be rectified as soon as possible, but it does mean that at the moment my most powerful weapon is diplomacy. I'd have preferred something considerably stronger. Noguchi nodded. Yet you have always been very capable at talking. I am sure you will do everything possible in these less than encouraging circumstances. I don't have a lot of options, do I? Asked Sisko. No, agreed Noguchi. And for that I am truly sorry. You are in a very difficult position. Then I'll simply have to work harder to extricate myself. With a sigh, Sisko signed off. Not good news. Not good at all. 7 days. Who knew what the invader would be up to in 7 days? He clambered to his feet, wishing he had time for a shower and some rest. Right now, they were luxuries he simply couldn't afford. He returned to Ops and caught Major Kira's eye. She didn't look at all happy. What's wrong now? He asked gently. Shakar is less than overjoyed with my report, Kira informed him. He is also less than happy with what we've done so far. He seems to share the majority opinion on Bajor. Sisko sighed. Which is that we should annihilate the invaders, he guessed. Something like that. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint him, and the rest of your planet. At the moment, I doubt we could eliminate a fly using the Defiance weapons. He tapped his communicator. Sisko to O'Brien. Give me some good news, Chief. I really need it. There was a slight cough and a muttered oath, and then O'Brien's testy reply. Weapons are up, Captain. We've got about 40% capacity right now. Thank you, Chief, Sisko said sincerely. That's the best news I've had all day. And, O'Brien added, the refugees are almost all evacuated. I've just got a systems check to run, and we can launch again in, 15 minutes, I'd estimate. Fontana and I can work on the weapons systems in flight. Chief, you're a marvel. Sisko nodded to Kira. Major, Dax, get Odo again and meet me on the Defiant. He managed a tight smile. We're going to practice our diplomacy. I'm not so sure about that, Harl said, staring at the comp. It seems potentially dangerous to me. Well, of course there will be some risk, Took agreed, scowling. But this is rebellion, right? We aim to show the Hive Masters what we think of their plans. We have to take some chances. I know that, Harl replied, trying not to let his anger get the better of him. Took was on his side, after all. But sabotaging the drones seems to me to be an indiscriminate method of striking at them. Someone might get injured. Afraid? Asked Took sneeringly. You're not truly committed to change, are you? No one can say that about me, Harl said. He felt like slamming his companion's head against the nearest metal wall. But I want to be certain that when I strike, it will harm only the Hive Masters. We are not at war with our fellows. I know that, of course, agreed Took, obviously attempting to placate him. But we have to get attention. Sabotaging the drones in this sector while they are hard at work will draw a lot of notice. Harl considered it. While the drones were replicating feverishly, it wouldn't be too difficult to cause a glitch in their programming. But there were an awful lot of workers around, and too many chances that one or more might be injured if something unexpected occurred. No, he decided finally. It's a good idea, but too risky. We'll have to find some other way of striking. He handed the comp back to Took. This is not the way. Scowling, Took accepted the compound graciously. "I think you're wrong," he complained. "But have it your way." "Good." Harl moved off to his next workstation, ignoring his companion in rebellion. Which was decidedly a mistake. As soon as Harl disappeared from view, a wide smile crossed Took's snout. "It doesn't matter what you wish," he said softly. "The sabotage will take place." He glanced down at the comp he held carefully. It had Harl's palm prints all over it, and he had been the one to use the keys to access the details of the sabotage. Once Took set the destruction in motion, it would be Harl who would be blamed for the resulting explosion. And Took was quite certain that there would be casualties. He'd already selected 3 victims who would be in the processing area when the drones exploded. With 3 victims and such a visible act of sabotage, Harl was bound to be arrested, tried, and convicted, just as Security Master Raldar had ordered. Pleased with his planning, Took set off to finish his task. Chapter 12. Gul Dukat stood stiffly at attention in the quarters of Gultar Hive. The suite of rooms was very Spartan, even by Cardassian standards. This would not have been so remarkable had Hive not been the effective ruler of the Cardassian Empire. Not technically, of course. Theoretically, Cardassia Prime was ruled by a citizens' council that was elected into power. Practically speaking, the council was no more than a figurehead for Hive and the military. They held the power, and power was everything. Despite this, Dukat was impressed that Hive eschewed almost all the trappings of power. His suite of rooms was larger than most, naturally, but he had more support staff in attendance. There were few furnishings beyond the utilitarian desks, monitors, and seats. There were no artworks of the sort that many of the lesser military loved to show off in their own quarters. Even the food for Hive's table came from a standard-issue replicator. Hive had always claimed that his position was one of responsibility and not privilege. Dukat sometimes believed that. More often, he believed that Hive believed it. "At ease," Hive finally barked, looking up from the report he had rather too ostentatiously been studying. It was the oldest "I'm in charge and you're not" trick in the book. Even the humans used it. "I've studied your reports and recommendations, Dukat. Incisive, interesting, and egotistical as ever." "Thank you, sir." Dukat inclined his head slightly. There were questions he was dying to discover the answers to, but there was no way he was going to ask them. It was up to Hive to announce his plans, or keep them bottled up, as he often did. "Your recommendations are provocative," Hive added, standing up. He was a thick-set, elderly figure, slightly shorter than Dukat, and he walked with a pronounced limp, the result of an old war wound, or at least so he claimed. Dukat said nothing, knowing this was merely a conversational gambit. Hive was trying to get him worried and nervous. With others, these tactics often worked, but Dukat had served under the Gultar for too long. He knew all of his affectations and mannerisms. Hive, knowing that Dukat knew this, tapped the computer screen. "You propose taking the home fleet to the Durain system and investigating this alien vessel further?" "Yes, sir," agreed Dukat. Now was the time to explain his reasoning. "The First Fleet is needed to protect our borders from Dominion infiltration. The Third Fleet is several days distant. The Second Fleet is monitoring events on the Klingon frontier. Only the home fleet could reach Durain in time to contact the aliens." "True," agreed Hive. "If that were our priority." He glowered at Dukat. "The home fleet is needed precisely where it is, at home. Your request is denied." Dukat scowled back. "Then we are to do nothing about this potential threat?" he asked, feigning surprise. "That is a little puzzling, sir." "I didn't say we're doing nothing." Hive hobbled out from behind his desk. I've contacted Gul Gavron and ordered him to investigate. But, sir, protested Dukat, the Third Fleet is several days away. I know, agreed Kiev. It's a pity, but there's nothing else to do. And I know that Gavron doesn't have your, shall we say, devious mind, Dukat, but there's no help for that. Sir, Dukat pointed out cautiously, I was the one who made the discovery of this alien hive. I monitored and reported on it. By rights, this assignment should be mine. Kiev waved a hand dismissively. By rights, he echoed. You have no rights that I don't allow you, Dukat, and never forget that. No, sir, Dukat agreed, casting his eyes down to the floor. I apologize if I have disappointed you. You haven't disappointed me, Kiev answered, a slight smile on his face. On the contrary, you've rarely pleased me more. Given the information that you have, your report and recommendations are perfect. If things were not as they are, I'd have given you permission to go hunting. I'm glad to see that you're so keen on getting the alien knowledge to help the military. Dukat looked confused. I'm sorry, Gultar, he said. Did I omit something from my analysis, then? Nothing you could have known about. Kiev appeared to consider for a moment. Then he said, Come here. He led the way to his one affectation, the wall-sized window looking out over the capital. The view of the city from here was breathtaking, looking down on the myriad buildings and complexes below the citadel. Dukat could see why Kiev had this window. It breathed power. Far, far below, tiny forms scurried about their business. Up here was where the heart of the Empire lay. It looks peaceful, doesn't it? Kiev asked him a moment later. Very, agreed Dukat. In a productive sort of way, of course. Of course, Kiev said dryly. But that is merely the surface. Scratch that view, and you will find any number of malcontents and troublemakers. Dukat frowned. There have always been those who dislike the power that the military have, sir, he objected. But they are a minority. They are hardly worth you being concerned about them. They can't get along with one another and have no organization at all. Until recently, Kiev told him. Now the resistance to the military is growing daily. Unrest is spreading. He grimaced. 3 days ago, a shipment of arms was intercepted and stolen on its way to the Bavroma spaceport. Dukat looked shocked. I hadn't heard about that, he replied. Of course you hadn't, Kiev responded. That's not the kind of news I allow to get out. He scowled out at the city below. Sooner or later, there will be an insurrection. My sources indicate that it will be sooner. That's why the home fleet stays here. He laid an arm on Dukat's shoulder. And why you do, too. I need good officers close to me. Officers I can trust. Let Gavron go after this alien vessel and seek glory. You will remain here with me, and we shall begin to hunt for traitors. You will be my right hand, Dukat. Isn't that more important than the mission you desired? Much more, Dukat thought. He'd known all along about the arms theft and had planned his recommendations very carefully. Kiev had done precisely what Dukat had hoped he would. Removed the Third Fleet from consideration and strengthened Dukat's own grip on power. By seeming eager for this mission, Dukat had made certain he wouldn't go on it. Let Gavron get the glory, if he could. Dukat rather suspected that these aliens had a few more tricks to play yet. It would be much better if Gavron was the one to fall in battle against them. Then Dukat could leap in to save the day. Dukat gave a smart salute. It is my duty to serve where I am most needed, Gultar, he said. And it is also my pleasure. Good, Kiev said, waving a dismissal. I knew you'd see the sense of it. Indeed I do, thought Dukat as he bowed and made his way from Kiev's quarters. Indeed I do. This time out, the Defiant felt right. Sisko sat back in the command chair, feeling more at ease. O'Brien, Fontana, and the other engineers had worked miracles on the ship's systems. Sisko's own tallies on his seat arms showed that shields were back to 95%, that engineering was on full, and that life support was functioning perfectly. Only the weapons systems remained in need of drastic work, which was where the chief and the lieutenant were right now, and weapons were already up to 60%. Sisko felt a whole lot better returning to the Hive with at least a few teeth he could bear, should it prove necessary. Diplomacy first, of course. Sisko hadn't needed Admiral Noguchi's orders to know that. But if diplomacy failed, it didn't hurt to carry a big stick and be prepared to use it. He still didn't know what to make of these aliens. They seemed to vacillate between making sense and making war. They claimed that the Duranians had been insane, but what did they mean by that word? Still, Hive Master Drawn had agreed to talk, and perhaps that would lead to a better understanding of what the Hive was after. His first directive as a Starfleet officer was to seek out new life, although this one seemed to have sought them out. It was important to understand the members of this species before he made judgments about them. Still, it was hard not to judge them yet, given the countless lives they had taken. But at that moment, Sisko had far too little information to build on. "Incoming message, Benjamin," Dax said softly, obviously bothered about interrupting his train of thought. "It's from Shakar." "Thanks, old man." Sisko managed a wan smile. "I'll take it in the ready room." He had been expecting this call for a while now, and still wasn't certain what he'd say. When he was alone, he activated his screen. "First Minister," he said politely, "what can I do for you?" Shakar was no fool. He had been Kira's leader in the Resistance, and Kira had the highest regard for him. Sisko, in turn, valued Kira's opinions and was certain that Shakar probably lived up to everything that the Major claimed of him. The First Minister raised an eyebrow. "Well, Captain, I assume that asking you to wipe out these murderers isn't likely to get me anywhere, is it?" "No, it isn't," agreed Sisko calmly, "though I do understand the request." "I thought you might." Shakar rubbed the back of his neck, looking suddenly very tired. "And I'm equally sure you understand that I'm being pressured constantly to make certain the Federation destroys the Hive." "Kai Wynn," guessed Sisko. Shakar managed a mirthless laugh. "That was too easy, Captain. Yes, of course she's demanding it. Loudly, frequently, and publicly. Anything to embarrass me, naturally." "I'm not totally surprised," admitted Sisko. "You have my sincere sympathies." "Well," Shakar finally asked, "what do you plan on doing?" "Talking to them," Sisko informed him. "Discovering what they want here, what their plans are, and who is responsible for what they did to Durain." "And then?" Shakar leaned forward eagerly. "I'm not sure," admitted Sisko. "But I will promise you this. Whoever is behind the destruction of Durain will pay for it. You have my word." There was a slight pause, and then Shakar nodded. "That's good enough for me." He managed a real smile. "Nerys holds you in very high regard, Captain. And I hold her in high regard. I am happier with your assurance." "Thank you." Sisko inclined his head slightly. "I will do my best to live up to my reputation." "Understood." Shakar nodded slightly and then cut contact. Leaning back in his seat, Sisko stared up at the ceiling for a few moments. At least Shakar wasn't pressuring him too much. That was about the only positive aspect of this entire mission. He knew that Shakar must be under tremendous pressure back on Bajor, but he had the wisdom not to try and pass that along. He was definitely shaping up to be a very good First Minister, unlike the previous ones Sisko had been forced to deal with. As long as the backstabbing so common in Bajoran politics didn't get to Shakar, he'd probably be the best thing to happen to the planet since the Cardassian withdrawal. Meanwhile, Sisko still had to do something about the Hive. Right on cue with this thought, his communicator beeped. "Sorry to disturb you, Captain," said Dax's voice, "but we're about to enter the Durain system." "On my way." Sisko collected his thoughts and returned to the bridge. Taking his seat, he said, "Put Durain 4 on visual as soon as you can, Dax." He wanted to see what had happened to the planet in the few hours since they had last left it. "Aye, sir," Dax acknowledged, concentrating on her instruments. While he could do little but wait, Sisko tapped his communication badge. Sisko to O'Brien. "Chief, how's it going?" There was a brief pause, and then O'Brien's reply. "All phasers are now online, Captain. I'd appreciate the chance to run another diagnostic before they're used, but if you need them, I'm pretty sure they'll be fine. Photon torpedoes will take us about another half hour or so." "Thank you, Chief," Sisko said gratefully. "That's excellent news. I won't bother you until you're finished. Sisko out." Phasers back online. Sisko hoped he wouldn't be needing them, and that this whole mess could somehow be resolved peacefully. But he couldn't envisage Hive Master Dran agreeing to punish himself and the other guilty parties for the destruction of Durain. Sooner or later, he felt that this would end up as a shooting war. The best Sisko could manage would be to make it later. "Durain on screen," Dax announced. Sisko and the bridge crew had been prepared to see the smoldering ruins of the planet. It still hung there in space, gases venting from the charred core. The alien ship had changed, however. It still hung above the planet, but the enveloping wings had once more straightened out. That wasn't what surprised Sisko. It was the activity down the center of the Hive's axis. There was a definite gap of some kind, with space showing through in several points. They were still too far away to make out any details beyond that, but every instinct in Sisko's body told him that whatever was going on spelled trouble in the worst way. "Dax," he said urgently, "what's happening? Is the Hive breaking up?" She didn't reply for a moment, instead turning all the sensors on the craft. Behind him, Sisko could hear Odo tapping frantic commands into his own panels. Finally, Dax sighed. "I don't know what's going on," she announced. "We're still not close enough for a good scan, but I'd say that whatever is happening there is no accident." "What do you mean?" asked Sisko, moving to stand directly behind her. "That line is much too straight and regular to be accidental," she pointed out. "If there were a problem, it would look more chaotic." "Maybe," agreed Sisko. "Keep scanning. Let me know the second you discover anything." He turned to Kira. "Try and contact the Hive Master," he said. "Let him know we're coming and that we expect to be allowed on board to talk." Then he turned to Odo, who was scowling over his own equipment. "Anything, Constable?" The changeling glanced up. Though he had never quite mastered the art of duplicating a human face precisely, he had definitely got the hang of looking worried. "It's difficult to say," he answered. "I've been scanning the rest of the system, on a hunch. There's a Cardassian science ship hanging about at the extreme limits of sensor contact." Sisko snorted. "I might have guessed that they're monitoring the whole business." "And doing nothing to help," agreed Odo. "I'd expect no more of them. But this means that they probably witnessed the battle, and the alien capabilities." He didn't have to finish that thought. Sisko nodded. "So we can probably expect a Cardassian delegation to try and join these talks soon." "That's what I'd predict." Odo scowled. "It won't make your job any easier." "I'd be happy if it simply doesn't make it harder," Sisko admitted. "Captain," called Dax, "I'm getting some very odd readings from the Hive." As Sisko hurried to join her, she explained, "I'm getting a preliminary sensor scan from the ship now. There are thousands of small mechanisms on the skin of the hive, and probably even more inside the vessel. Repairing the break? Sisko hazarded. No, creating it. Dax looked up, her strong face shrouded in puzzlement. They're splitting the hive in two. Chapter 13. None of this was making sense of any kind to Sisko. Why would the hive apparently be destroying itself? There had to be something here that they were all missing. Tapping his communicator, Sisko called, "Sisko to O'Brien. Chief, you want to take a look at what's happening with the hive right now?" "I'm on my way to the bridge anyway," came O'Brien's response. "Be with you in a minute or so." Sisko stared at the screen. They were still too far away to make out details on the hive, but in his mind he could see the mechanisms running over the ship. Why were they trying to break the hive in half? Had something gone wrong? Or was this somehow planned? "I've spoken to the hive master," Kira announced. "He's given me a set of beam-down coordinates." "Did he sound at all worried?" asked Sisko. "No, more bored and put upon, if you ask me." So whatever was happening to the hive wasn't a mistake. He'd never have sounded so calm if his world was breaking apart. Sisko nodded. "I'll be taking just a small team, Major," he said softly. "Would you be very offended if I left you here in command?" Kira's eyes sparkled. "It's probably the best idea, Captain," she answered sincerely. "I'm not sure I could restrain myself from killing somebody down there." Sisko managed a small smile. "I may have similar trouble," he confessed. "Dax, you'll be with me. Odo, you too." Odo inclined his head slightly. "Why me? Not that I mind accompanying you, but surely the chief would be more logical." "To check out the technology?" Sisko guessed. "Maybe. But this is, in effect, a police action. I think you'd be of much more use in that. Plus, you have quite an uncanny knack for seeing through lies and bravado." "It comes from associating with Quark too much," Odo complained. "I'll be happy to help out." The turbolift doors hissed open, and O'Brien emerged. "Good grief," he muttered, witnessing what was happening on the screen. He hurried to the science station and began his scans. The Defiant was closing fast on the hive now. The ship was growing slowly on the forward screen, and some details finally started to emerge on the ship's hull. The machines at work there varied greatly in size, but they all seemed to be moving with feverish activity. Whatever their purposes, they were busy little mechs. "Chief?" prompted Sisko. O'Brien glanced up from his readings and shook his head slightly in bafflement. "You've got to admire their technology," he finally offered. "They're ingenious little murderers." He gestured at the main screen. "They're disassembling parts of the structure to split the hive into two." "We can see that," Sisko observed. "But why?" "Beg your pardon, Captain. I wasn't clear," O'Brien replied. "They're splitting the ship into two ships. Those mechs are taking the first ship apart very carefully and then reproducing the part that's been lost. It's a mechanical equivalent of an amoeba splitting into two, and obviously for the same reason. They're breeding." Sisko stared at the screen in shock. "Two ships," he repeated. "They're making a second hive?" "Right, sir," said O'Brien. "And a heck of a lot faster than I'd have believed possible. I'd say that in 2 or 3 days, tops, there will be 2 hives sitting there in space." He shrugged. "Now we know why they demolished Durain. They needed the spare materials for the split." "And if one ship can destroy a planet," Kira offered, 2 should be able to demolish a star system." Sisko nodded. Kira had made the most important point. "Then we'd better ensure that they do nothing of the kind. How long till we're in transporter range?" 2 minutes, Kira answered. "Fine. We'll contact you every half hour. If you don't hear from us for any reason, then contact Starfleet and inform them." Sisko gave her a grave look. "And then, use your best judgment." Do you understand me?
Perfectly. Kira stood up, ready to take the command chair. I'm not going to start shooting up the Hive without good cause, I promise. But if anything happens to the three of you, that may just be good cause.
Look after my ship and crew, Sisko ordered. Then he rested his hand on her arm. Like Shakar, I trust you, Nerys.
I won't let you down, she promised.
I know. Sisko turned to Dax. Well, old man, time to get moving. Dax and Odo fell in beside him as he headed for the turbolift. Now, thought Sisko, we discover just how good a diplomat I really am. The stars were as magnificent as they had ever been, but Sana could not bring herself to look upon them. Ever since she had been a youngster, she had loved only two things, the stars and Torque. Now she had lost the latter and was cutting herself off from the former. Her life could hardly be more miserable than it was now. Sana. It was her old tutor, Bree. She was a little bowed by age, but her eyes and spirits were as bright as ever. What's wrong? Are you ill? Ill? Sana sighed. In my soul, yes, very ill. Bree came closer and stroked the edge of Sana's shell. Want to talk about it? We oldsters have little left to enjoy in life but talk. You are not old, Sana replied. Flattering, but not true, Bree answered with a woof of amusement. And have I not always taught you to be a scrupulously accurate observer? Sana almost managed a smile at that. She gestured out of the observation window. Those stars are old. You are not. Cheat. But Bree was amused. Now, if you feel up to it, can you not tell me what troubles you? Composing herself, Sana discovered that she didn't know where to begin. Finally, she said, Life is so wrong. Bree snorted again. That is a statement I have heard many times from youngsters. Let me tell you something. It rarely gets any more right as you age. Now, what ails you? My determination was today. Then I should think you would be very happy, Bree objected. I recall my determination day quite clearly. Malco and I shared that evening a good meal, a bottle of Kling, and a bed. It was a lot of fun. I shall be sharing nothing, Sana replied, wrinkling her snout. I have been assigned to Team 2. Ah, and the only male for you is on Team 1, eh? Bree shrugged her shoulders as much as she could, given her arthritis and the extra weight of her aging shell. Yes. Well, the split isn't final for 2 days, Bree pointed out. You could have quite a busy time with him before that. I do not simply want to mate with him, Sana answered. I wish to be one with him. Take what you can get, suggested Bree. Then later there will be another to take his place. Sana simply couldn't accept this cynicism. I do not want another. I want only Torque. Maybe now, agreed Bree. But you will come to your senses later. Did everyone get this jaundiced with age? Sana shook her head. That is not necessarily true. But even if I did wish only to mate, it would not be possible. Torque is a hive master and is currently very occupied with the great design. He would have no time to spare for mere mating. Then he is a very foolish male. Bree snickered to herself. Anyway, if he is a hive master, he could get you reassigned to Team 1. Sana was shocked. That would be an immoral use of power, and Torque would not agree to such a thing. You youngsters, Bree snorted. It is done all the time, believe me. I knew Dron when he was younger, and some of the abuses of power he has managed over the years would shock you.
Torque opposes such abuses, Sana pointed out. How could he then indulge in them? Besides which, there are heavier weights on his shell. Bree wrinkled her snout. Heavier weights than mating on a young male's mind? That is something I do not hear very often. What concerns this prodigious individual that you love? Sana took a deep breath, knowing she was violating a confidence, and knowing that she could not stay silent. The planet that was just absorbed, she said slowly. There were inhabitants still upon it. What? All traces of humor had vanished from Bree's elderly face now. Instead, there was anger and grim attentiveness. You are sure of this? I am. Sana bowed her head. Torque himself confirmed this to me. There were thousands of sentient beings on the world that we destroyed. Bree's face was twisted with anger and horror. Sentient? You are certain of this? I am. Torque informed me that they were insane and refused to leave the planet despite an offer of assistance. Then they attacked our ships, which were forced to defend themselves. Chittering angrily under her breath, Bree scowled, obviously deep in thought. Then she looked up again. Insane or no, the Hive Masters had no right to kill them. They should have been removed by force if necessary, but not killed. I agree, Sana informed her. The guilt of what we have done hangs heavily on my shell. And this youngster of yours, snapped Bree, this prodigy of morality, he did nothing at all to stop this massacre? He wanted to, Sana explained, desperately seeking to rebuild Torque's image in the older scientist's mind. But he is new and did not know what to do or say. He is consumed with guilt and anger also. And so he should be. Then Bree seemed to realize how distressed Sana was. She stroked the edge of the younger one's shell. If you say he is a good person, then I am certain he will do what he can. The problem is that Drawn will not allow it. She wrinkled her snout in disgust. As I told you, I knew that one when I was younger. Even then, he was devious, a liar and a manipulator. I doubt he has changed at all in the decades since. You can be certain that he has plans for your youngster. No matter how moral and clever your one-to-be is, he will not be a match for Drawn. Then there is nothing to be done? Asked Sana in despair. That was not what I said, snapped Bree angrily. You are a scientist, child. There is always something that may be done in all circumstances. The point is to discover the best way to do things. If what you say is true, and I can see by your distress that it is, then there will be plenty of people who, like us, will abhor what has happened. We cannot allow this to happen again. But how can we change things? Asked Sana miserably. The Hive Masters are in command. They make the decisions. Bree snorted again. For now, perhaps. With a shock, Sana realized what her elderly mentor meant. You are speaking of mutiny, she whispered, almost too afraid to say the word. I am speaking of sanity, Bree argued. If the Hive Masters make decisions that go against the beliefs of the Hive, then they should be masters no more. Is that not logical? It is also treasonous, Sana gasped. Since the 203rd Hive, there has never been a rebellion against the authority of the Hive Masters. And the 203rd Hive lost. Then it is high time someone questioned the authority of those fools and murderers, Bree snapped. It may be that we shall lose also, but I will not stand by and accept the murder of even the insane as justifiable. Sana gazed at her mentor with new respect. And nor shall I, she said, quietly but firmly. What has happened is appalling and wrong. A A repetition of it must be prevented at all costs. Bree tapped her on the shell. You have courage, my child, she said approvingly. Nurture it. You are likely to have great need of it in the days ahead. Now, it's a fine night, and I am going to talk a little treason, so you'd better keep yourself busy while I am gone. You will have to cover for me, child. She winked. Get those young eyes of yours back to observing, and make plenty of notes for the both of us, eh? The room in which Sisko, Dax, and Odo materialized was completely unremarkable. It was clearly the anteroom to somewhere more interesting, but contained only small tables and some very odd-looking pieces of furniture, along with two of the armadillo-like aliens, both armed with slender, rifle-like weapons. Though neither had the devices pointed at any of the arrivals, they were clearly there to prevent any trouble that Sisko or the others might offer. I will inform the Hive Masters that you have arrived, one of the guards announced as he exited the room. The other guards said nothing and barely glanced in their direction. Sisko decided that the best thing to do was to return the silent treatment. He glanced at Dax and then at one of the odd pieces of furniture. It resembled a long, stiff board that was inclined backward at about a 15-degree angle. About 2 feet from the floor was a horn-like projection. There were several of these odd items about the room. What do you think that is? He asked her. Probably a chair, she answered. Smiling at the silent guard, she gestured. Look at those shells of theirs. Wonderful for protection, but I doubt they can sit down. They must use these boards to lean against, and the protrusion to rest upon. That makes sense, Sisko agreed. But a bit uncomfortable for me, I'm afraid. I think I'll remain standing. He wandered across to the doorway, but could see only a short corridor through it. The 3 visible walls were blank. Then at the far end, an iris opening appeared. The guard who had remained with them turned at the slight mechanical sound, and then gestured with his weapon. You may proceed, he announced. Thank you, Sisko said politely. He led the way to the iris and then stepped through. They were now inside a much larger chamber. In the center of the room was a large table. Around it were more than a dozen of the odd chairs, and most were occupied. At the head of the table was the alien Sisko recognized as Dron. Hive Master, he said politely. Captain, Dron responded, inclining his head slightly. Please, will you and your companions join us? Thank you. Sisko crossed to the table where a room had been cleared for them. There was nowhere to sit, but Sisko didn't feel like resting at this moment anyway. You will forgive my manners if I get right to the point of this meeting, he asked. Dron spread his arms. If you wish, Captain. We have no desire to alarm you or offend you. It's too late for that, Sisko thought, the image of Durain in his mind. Aloud, he said, We could not help but notice as we approached that there is considerable work going on the skin of the hive. My engineer tells me that this seems to be aimed at splitting the hive into 2 separate, complete hives. Dron inclined his head again. Your engineer is quite perceptive. That is indeed what is being done. May I ask the reason for this? The reason? Dron appeared genuinely puzzled. Surely that is obvious, Captain. We are doubling our chances of survival. When the work is completed, we shall have 2 hives, and our population is to be divided between them. Each hive shall then go on its separate way. And where will this separate way take them? Asked Sisko. Dron tapped commands into the computer pad that lay on the table before him. I will call up the schematics for you if you wish, Captain, he answered. We do not intend to hide anything from you. Ah. There was clearly a holographic projector beneath the surface of the table, for a very detailed map of the local area sprang into being. One star was marked in red, and he recognized it immediately as Durain. That is where we are now, Dron said. When the fission is complete, the two hives will move in separate directions. He tapped in further commands, and the red ball of light split in two. Each then started to move across the projected starscape. Dax leaned forward. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the simulated motion. "Benjamin," she said softly, "one of those hives is going to head into Cardassian space. The other..." She took a deep breath. "The other is aimed at Bajor." Sisko turned to face Drawn again. "And what will these hives do?" he demanded. "Is what happened to Durain going to happen again?" "Absorption?" asked Drawn. "That was necessary to begin the fission. And once it is accomplished, we shall need to gather new materials to restock the two hives. Further planets must then be mined." "Mined?" Sisko echoed, appalled. "You're talking about the destruction of more planets." He jabbed a finger at the projection. "You're telling me that you aim to demolish Bajor." Chapter 14. Apparently unable to comprehend what the fuss was about, Drawn blinked. "If that is the name of the planet, then yes. We aim to absorb Bajor next." "You can't do that," Sisko exclaimed, striving to keep his temper in check. "Billions of people live there. You can't condemn them all to death." "We are condemning no one, Captain," Drawn replied. "We do not wish to harm any living being, no matter how insane they may be. We are quite prepared to wait a reasonable length of time until the planet has been evacuated before it is absorbed. Would 3 of their days be sufficient?" Sisko could hardly believe what he was hearing. 3 days, he echoed hollowly. To evacuate an entire planet? "We could wait longer," Drawn said, obviously believing he was being generous. "As many as 7, should it prove necessary." "You can't be serious," Odo snapped. "You expect the Bajorans simply to pack up and leave their homes?" "Homes?" Drawn appeared to be puzzled again. "It is only a planet. Why would they not agree to leave if it is necessary to our survival?" "Because they live there," snarled Odo. "The planet is their home." "That is absurd," one of the other Hive Masters broke in. I am Makarn, Science Master," he added. "It is simply not possible that any, sane race would choose to live on the surface of a planet." "Quite," agreed Drawn. "After all, Captain, did you not tell me that you are all living on a space station?" He smiled. "And do you consider yourself sane or not?" Sisko shook his head slightly. "It is true that we all live on a space station," he agreed slowly. "But that alone is no decider of sanity. We have all also lived on planets, and may yet do so again." "There is no reasoning with such creatures," exclaimed another of the Hive Masters. He glowered at Sisko. "Clearly they are not completely civilized or intelligent." Dax stared back at the alien until he flinched and looked away. "Is that your sole criterion for determining mental state?" she asked mildly. "Whether a person lives on a planetary surface or in space?" "Not entirely," Drawn replied smoothly. "But it is quite obviously the basis for such a judgment. No sane person would subject himself to the vagaries and hazards of an exposed world." "That's a very far-flung accusation," Sisko commented. "And since obviously none of you have lived on the surface of a planet, it smacks to me more of prejudice than fact." "I told you they were incapable of reason," the angry Hive Master broke out again. "Pakat," Drawn said admonishingly. "They are still our guests for the time being. Please do not be so rude to them." He turned back to Sisko. "My apologies, Captain, but Pakat is the defense master. It is his responsibility to keep the Hive safe. He takes his duties very seriously." "Ah." Sisko stared at Pakat, determined to remember his face. "And it was you, then, who led this massacre? Defense? Paquette corrected, with as much dignity as he could. "We were attacked first." "No," Sisko answered. "You began the engagement by attempting to steal what does not belong to you, a world belonging to an intelligent species. As a representative of the United Federation of Planets, I have to inform you that this alone makes you the aggressors in our eyes." "We are not interested in your warped moral perspectives," Paquette snapped. "Captain," Dran said hastily, "how could anyone own a planet, or a star, or a comet? They are simply resources to be utilized to their fullest. The inhabitants of the world we absorbed were not using it, and we needed it. Why, then, the accusation of theft?" Odo growled, "You just don't understand, do you? You can't simply take a planet because you want to." Dran spread his arms. "We did not want it. We needed it. And we need more planets for further raw materials. We shall take them as we must. It is not theft. It is survival." Sisko was feeling very frustrated. It was quite clear that they were simply not getting through to these Hive masters. Their attitudes and philosophies were fundamentally different from anything Sisko had ever experienced before. "Perhaps what is needed here," he suggested, "is better understanding of each other's point of view." Dran inclined his head. "How do you mean, Captain?" "We don't seem to be comprehending one another," Sisko answered. "Perhaps what is needed is that we spend some time together in trying to see the other's perspective." An elderly Hive master spoke up. "Ah, I begin to see," he commented. "I am Hosir, master of very little at the moment." He moved forward. "Perhaps if you were to visit with us for a while and see the Hive itself, with one of us as your guide, you would better understand what we believe in." "Precisely," agreed Sisko. "Perhaps you would be good enough to honor us by showing us around." Hosir snorted. "I can barely walk across the room without pain, Captain. I would be a poor guide, believe me." He gestured at a younger person beside him. "Might I suggest Torque instead? He is a very capable young man, and possessed of both great knowledge and great enthusiasm." "No!" Paquette exclaimed. He glared angrily at the visitors. "This is obviously merely a trick by these creatures to study us for weaknesses. They have shown in words and action that they mean to attack us." There was always one paranoid, Sisko reflected. "No," he said gently. "We genuinely wish to understand your people, and I think that this is the best way to do it." He turned to Dran. "If you are worried that we are here to act as spies, then simply tell Torque not to show us anything to do with your war effort." "We have no war effort," Dran said smoothly. "We do not attack. We only defend ourselves." He considered for a moment. "But your point is well made, Captain." He turned to Torque. "Will you be good enough to show our visitors about the Hive, Torque? Allow them to converse freely and answer their questions to the best of your ability. But do not take them to the defense areas." Torque nodded, and Sisko saw a gleam of something in the young alien's eyes. Worry? Eagerness? "I would be honored," Torque replied. "I agree that it is important that our motives and thoughts be correctly understood." "Excellent," Dran said. "Now, Captain, perhaps we could offer you a little refreshment before your explorations commence." "Thank you," Sisko answered. "That is very gracious of you. Also, may I have your permission to contact my ship and inform them of what we have already discussed? I told them I would check in every 30 of our minutes." "Of course, Captain." Dran inclined his head. "Do you desire privacy for this contact?" "No," Sisko said. "After all, we are being open with one another, aren't we?" He smiled and then tapped his communicator. "Sisko to Kira." "Kira here," came back the Major's voice. "Is everything okay, Captain?" "We're fine," Sisko answered. "And we're about to get a guided tour. which may take some time. However, we do have some news that you may wish to pass along. The Hive is indeed undergoing fission, as the chief surmised. When it finishes this process in a couple of days, there will be 2 hives. One will be heading into Cardassian space. The other will go toward Bajor. There was no mistaking the tension in Kira's voice. Are you saying what I think? Yes. Sisko kept his voice as calm as possible. Hive Master Dron informs me that his people aim to process Bajor next. He is willing to give your people a week to evacuate the planet. Captain, that's crazy, Kira protested. Those murdering... That's enough, Sisko snapped. You have your orders, Major. Pass along the information to Shakar and stand ready for further messages from me. Sisko out. Dron blinked mildly. Dear me, he murmured. She sounds like a very excitable person. I do hope you can rely on her. I know I can. Sisko smiled without warmth. And it's her home planet that you're talking about destroying next. I think she has every right to be excitable. Now, did you mention refreshments? Shakar switched off his screen, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and sighed. Then he sat back in his chair, almost too numb to feel anything. Nerys had delivered what virtually amounted to a death warrant for Bajor just moments ago. Shakar knew that he should be feverishly working on defense plans, evacuation plans, and the prophets knew maybe a dozen other plans, too. But for the moment, it all seemed utterly futile. At this moment, there were thousands of refugees from Durain 4, either here on the planet or else on Deep Space Nine, all seeking to regain some semblance of life. They had fled one destroyed world and were now apparently sitting on another doomed world, along with several billion other Bajorans. And they were all his responsibility. Shakar was their first minister, and it was up to him to cope with this overwhelming situation. But there was, practically speaking, nothing much he could do. Oh, the aliens had offered Bajor a week. A week! To evacuate the population. Aside from the fact that the logistics of such an exodus were impossible even in tenfold the time, it really wasn't a viable option anyway. Shakar knew that the majority of the population would refuse to leave their homes, no matter what odds were against them. That left him exactly one option: to fight. But Bajor had never concentrated on arming itself again. In the resistance war with the Cardassian occupiers, the Bajorans had used light weaponry. They had nothing else. Now, 3 years after the occupation was ended, they still had very little in terms of planetary defenses. They had concentrated on rebuilding their wrecked world and shattered economy, not on preparing for war. They had all looked to their Federation alliance for aid in that quarter. Aid that would now not be coming in time. Shakar knew that Captain Sisko and his associates would do everything in their power to defend Bajor, but frankly, it was nowhere near enough against this alien hive. The recent destruction of the Enterprise had left a large gap in the Federation coverage of this sector, and it would take too long for replacement vessels to arrive that might have the firepower to take on the hive. When the hive came hunting for Bajor, everything that Deep Space Nine and the ground defenses of Bajor could throw at it would barely slow it down. Visions of the destruction of Durain filled his head. That would be the fate of Bajor. The Bajor he'd pledged to govern and protect to the best of his ability. Damn it, he thought. It just isn't fair. Why was the fate of his world and his entire people now resting so heavily on his shoulders? What could he be expected to do? What was it that the prophets required of him? Shakar. His head jerked up as he was startled out of his troubling thoughts. For a second, he thought he'd imagined the voice, but then there was a movement in the shadows at the end of his office, and a robed figure emerged. Kai Wynn, he exclaimed in surprise. How did you get in here? I gave explicit orders that I was not to be disturbed. With the regal serenity that Shakar was certain she practiced in front of mirrors when alone, Kai Wynn glided across the room. She inclined her head slightly. "I am sure that you did, my child," she murmured, oozing sympathy and understanding. She could fake them very well, Shakar knew. "But you are already disturbed, are you not, by your thoughts?" "How did you get in here?" he repeated, standing up and glaring down at her. He resented her patronizing attitude and had never accepted her in the role of Kai, spiritual leader of all Bajor. She was perhaps one of the least spiritual people he'd ever met in his life. All she cared about was her own power. "There are ways known only to the prophets, my child," she finally answered evasively. "And secret passages known only to the religious orders, I'll warrant," Shakar snapped. "Well, you're here now, so say your piece before I have you escorted out. Oh, very respectfully, of course." Wynne smiled serenely. "Of course," she agreed. "I did not think for an instant you would show the Kai less respect than she deserves. But I came to discuss your needs and the needs of Bajor at this troubled time." "What do you know of this troubled time?" he asked her. "Only what the prophets have seen fit to show me," Wynne answered. Her hands appeared from the arms of her ornamental robes. One held a small scroll. "I have been studying the third prophecy of Andiki, and it is obviously about the crisis in which we find ourselves." "With all due respect to the prophets," began Shakar, but she cut him off with a gesture. "Yes, let us all show due respect to the prophets." She glared mildly at him. "I understand your anger and frustration, my child, but this is very relevant. Listen." She unraveled the scroll and began to read from it. "The land will be torn asunder as great wings hover. Death will be on all who witness, and mourning on the lips of the few who survive. Weep for the lost, the children, the land. Weep, for it and they are no more. In that terrible day shall all my people be one. Stand firm, for one shall protect you, and two shall convert. In their faith, Bajor will be made whole." She let the scroll roll up again and slipped it back inside her voluminous sleeves. "Surely, my child, you can see what at least a part of this means." Shakar considered himself as devout as the next person, but he knew that the prophets always spoke in riddles. Many of the prophecies were couched in obscure terms and subject to any number of interpretations. The third book of Andiki is notoriously used by many unscrupulous and misguided individuals to predict the end of the world as we know it, he said. "I am surprised that you have joined their number, Kai Wynne." She didn't let the accusation annoy her. "It is so used by people who lack true insight," she answered calmly. "But to those that the prophets have anointed, the book reveals many mysteries. Besides," she allowed a fleeting smile to cross her face, "I can hardly be called misguided if I see the end of Bajor in the current situation, can I? After all, the Hive will be heading here next, I believe. And that will surely presage the end of the world if we do not act wisely." "How did you hear about that?" he demanded. Someone must have informed her, despite his order for absolute secrecy. "How I know is not important," she said. "What we are to do, however, is vital. Surely you can see that the first stanza refers to the destruction of Durain 4. That needs no interpretation, my child. The second stanza, however, is more difficult. One shall protect you, and two shall convert." Shakar regarded her suspiciously. "Even if I grant that the first stanza may be about Durain, I don't see what the second means at all." "Of course you do not, my child." Wynne spread her arms and smiled. "That is why I am here. If I cannot understand the prophets correctly, who can?" "My pet Draka could understand the prophets better than you," thought Shakar, but he was not foolish enough to say it aloud. Wynne was cunning, and she clearly had something in mind for this meeting. "And what is your interpretation?" he asked. "The one who stands firm is obviously myself," she replied seriously. "I stand firm as I always have in the faith of the prophets. The two who shall convert." She gave him a pitying gaze. "You are, I am afraid, one of those. Your lack of piety and trust in the prophets is hardly secret, is it?" "I do my duty by the prophets," Shakar snapped. "No one can say otherwise." Wynne shook her head chidingly. "None of us do all of our duty, my child. Even I sometimes fall short of what is expected of me. But we must all strive harder to obey the will of the prophets." "I don't see that your prophecy gives me anything to even consider," he replied, irritated at her fake piety. "And you still haven't told me who the second person is who must convert." "The answer to both is tied to the other," Kai Wynne informed him. "You alone, commanding the government, could never hope to stand against these murderous alien predators. If you stand with me and the religious forces who follow me, then there is a better chance. To win the forthcoming battle, though, you will need further aid." "From whom?" growled Shakar. "The Federation cannot reach us, and the Cardassians would never agree to help. They have a hive of their own to contend with. There is nobody else who can help." "Oh?" asked a fresh voice. "I am sorry to hear that I have been forgotten so quickly." Shakar spun about. He was going to tear this room apart to find that secret entrance when Wynne was gone. Now, who could... He stopped cold, staring at the tall, saturnine man who had stepped out of the shadows. "Jarrow," he breathed. Jarrow's face broke into a smile. "It's good to see that I haven't been forgotten during my absence," he murmured, moving closer to the Kai. End of Side 3.